In the early hours of September 29, 2016, off Neiafu in Tonga's Vava'u Islands, police in a small patrol boat found themselves in a tense standoff on the open Pacific. Ahead, a sailing yacht named Sea Oak was making a desperate bid for freedom. At its helm was an American sailor, accused of murdering his wife just weeks earlier. As officers drew closer, he raised a flare gun. A fiery projectile streaked toward the patrol boat, forcing them to veer off. He shouted threats to set their vessel ablaze if they continued the chase. Reluctantly, the officers pulled back as the Sea Oak vanished into the night, a brazen jailbreak. It was the climax of a saga that began months earlier with a mysterious death aboard the same yacht and would evolve into an international battle for justice. To the outside world, the idyllic harbour of Neiafu in Tonga's Vava'u archipelago looks like paradise. Dozens of sailboats often bob peacefully in the port of refuge, a deep blue harbour ringed by lush green islands. Neiafu is a sleepy Tongan town with whitewashed churches and a one-road waterfront. It's a popular haven for intrepid yachties, sailors from around the globe seeking adventure in the South Pacific. In mid-2016, one such vessel anchored in Neiafu's harbour was the Sea Oak, a 42-foot sloop with a Canadian flag. Aboard were a middle-aged couple, 54-year-old Dean J. Fletcher, an American citizen, and his wife, 56-year-old Patricia Kearney, who was Canadian. They had set sail from Mexico in 2015, crossing the Pacific and arriving in Tonga by May 2016. By all accounts, Dean and Patricia were experienced cruisers living a dream life at sea. They had a reputation among fellow sailors in Mexico as a quiet but friendly couple who kept to themselves while preparing for their voyage. But in Tonga, some in the harbour community saw another side. Other boaters later reported hearing the couple arguing loudly and even witnessing physical fights on board Sea Oak during their stay in Neiafu. On the afternoon of July 6, 2016, that tension boiled over into violence. According to witnesses, Dean Fletcher had gone ashore in Neiafu earlier in the day, and Patricia took a small inflatable dinghy to pick him up at the dock. As the dinghy made its way back towards Sea Oak, moored in the harbour, a heated quarrel erupted between husband and wife within earshot of people on nearby boats. What happened next was shocking. Several local scuba diving operators noticed the dinghy swerving as Dean began assaulting Patricia in plain view. One witness would later describe seeing Dean grab his wife's head, slam his knee into her neck, and punch her in the head repeatedly. Others saw him kicking and pummeling Patricia even as the dinghy pulled alongside Sea Oak, as if the violence continued, while he forced her up onto the yacht. Those who glimpsed the attack were horrified. It was a brutal beating unfolding on the water, the kind of scene utterly alien to the serene beauty of Vava'u. By the time darkness fell that evening, no alarm had yet been raised. There's no report of anyone intervening or calling the police during the assault. Perhaps those who saw it were momentarily stunned or unsure what to do. Sea Oak lay at anchor through the night, quiet aside from the gentle lapping of waves. It wasn't until the next morning, July 7th, that Dean Fletcher sought help, but not for a crime, rather for a supposed accident. At about 8 a.m., Dean arrived at the local Neiafu police station, looking distraught, and reported that his wife had died aboard their yacht under tragic circumstances. He told Tongan police officers that Patricia had slipped and fallen down the stairs of the yacht during the night, suffering a fatal injury. The 42-foot Sea Oak did have a short stairway, a companionway ladder leading below deck, and Dean claimed that his wife's fall was a horrible mishap. He explained that Patricia had an incurable nerve disorder, which, combined with alcohol, made her unsteady, implying that her death was an accident caused by illness and intoxication. This was the story he offered. Impaired, Patricia simply tumbled and struck her head. Tongan authorities immediately opened an investigation. When police boarded Sea Oak, the scene did not align neatly with Dean's account of a mere fall. Patricia's body was found on board, and an autopsy later revealed multiple traumatic injuries. Not just a single head bump one might expect from a stumble. The medical report showed that she died from excessive blood loss and an intracranial hemorrhage as a result of multiple blunt impacts to the head, chest, and abdomen, according to case documents. In other words, she had been beaten severely. Investigators also learned of the witnesses who had seen Dean attacking Patricia on the dinghy the previous day. Moreover, one acquaintance told police they saw a blood-stained bedsheet in the dinghy after the alleged fall, and that Dean later dropped this sheet into the sea, as if disposing of evidence. These damning details made it clear Patricia's death was no accident. By the afternoon of July 11th, Tongan police had gathered enough evidence to formally charge Dean J. Fletcher in connection with his wife's death. Initially, the charge was manslaughter, per a police statement, likely reflecting Patricia's death during a domestic assault without premeditation. But as the investigation progressed, Tongan prosecutors prepared to charge him with more serious offences, including murder. When officers informed Dean Fletcher that he was under arrest for causing Patricia's death, the middle-aged sailor's demeanour shifted. He vehemently denied harming his wife, insisting to anyone who would listen that he didn't kill his wife, and that the accusation was ridiculous. Nonetheless, the evidence of foul play was overwhelming. Police took him into custody in Neiafu to await legal proceedings. Tonga's justice system would now have to handle a rare and high-profile homicide case. The Pacific Kingdom of Tonga has one of the lowest murder rates in the world, and a foreigner being charged with killing his spouse was virtually unheard of. The situation was tense for local authorities. They wanted to ensure this American suspect did not slip away. Initially, Dean was held at a small jail facility on Vava'u, the island where Neiafu is located, rather than being transferred immediately to the main island capital. In these remote islands, custody arrangements can be surprisingly informal. Other yachties later whispered that Dean Fletcher might have been the only prisoner in the tiny Vava'u lockup, which perhaps lacked rigorous security. In fact, one rumour claimed that he was often left alone with the key to his jail cell, an astonishing lapse, if true. Tongan police have never confirmed that detail, but it paints a picture of a laid-back island jail, ill-equipped for a determined inmate. On top of that, Tongan prisons do not provide meals to inmates. Prisoners rely on family to bring them food each day. With Dean's wife deceased and no relatives in Tonga, he had to depend on sympathetic fellow sailors and local volunteers to deliver him food while he was locked up. It was an unusual situation. A man accused of a brutal killing being fed by acquaintances in the community that he may have betrayed. Whether due to lax oversight or sheer audacity, Dean tried to make a break for freedom almost immediately after being charged. On July 11, 2016, the very day he was formally accused in court, Fletcher pretended he needed to use the restroom at the police station. When a guard granted him permission, Dean took the chance to bolt for the door. He dashed out of the station barefoot, attempting to flee into the town's streets. A brief foot chase ensued through Neiafu's modest downtown, startling locals who saw officers sprinting after a ponytailed foreigner in handcuffs. Fortunately, police quickly caught and tackled him before he got far. This first escape attempt was thwarted within minutes. It proved that Fletcher was already scheming to avoid facing justice. After this, authorities kept him under tighter watch, at least for a while. Over the next several weeks, the case against Dean Fletcher solidified. By late July, a Tongan magistrate upgraded the charges. A grand jury indictment would eventually include murder with intent, murder by recklessness, manslaughter, and grievous bodily harm, essentially covering every possible degree of criminal culpability for Patricia's death. Prosecutors were casting a wide net, so that a jury could consider lesser charges if they didn't find premeditation. If convicted of the most serious charge, intentional murder, Tongan law stipulated a mandatory sentence of death or life imprisonment. However, Tonga hadn't actually carried out an execution in over 3 decades. The last was in 1981, so life in prison was the realistic maximum punishment. This was still an extremely serious case by Tonga's standards. Meanwhile, Dean Fletcher remained behind bars on Vava'u as 2016's austral winter turned to spring. He continued to insist on his innocence. I love my wife with all my heart and soul, and there's nothing I regret worse than the death of my wife. I had nothing to do with it, he told a Tongan detective, according to later reports. No one in the Tongan police was buying his story. As the weeks went by, plans were being made to eventually transfer Fletcher to the main island of Tonga Tapu for trial in the capital, Nuku'alofa. But before that could happen, Dean made a daring move that would humiliate the Tongan authorities. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 29, 2016, nearly 3 months after his initial arrest, Dean Fletcher escaped custody again, this time successfully. The exact details of this jailbreak remain murky, and Tongan police have stayed quiet on how the murder-accused escaped. What is known is that sometime in the very early morning hours, Fletcher slipped out of the poorly secured Vava'u jail. There were rumours that he had outside help, perhaps fellow sailors who felt sympathy or were convinced of his innocence. Unconfirmed reports suggested someone might have left a door unlocked or provided him with tools. In a small island community, it's not unthinkable that Dean befriended a guard or a local who was swayed by his pleas. One way or another, he walked free when almost everyone was asleep. Fletcher's objective upon escaping was immediately clear. He wanted to retrieve Sea Oak and flee Tonga by sea. Since July, the Sea Oak had been sitting impounded at anchor in Neiafu Harbor, within sight of town. Police had taped off the boat's cockpit and mast with bright yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze. But astonishingly, it appears there was no officer actively guarding the yacht overnight. In the pre-dawn gloom, Dean managed to get aboard his yacht, perhaps rowing a skiff out quietly or even swimming, and he reclaimed Sea Oak from under the noses of the law. Residents later awoke to find the impounded yacht gone, the police tape cut and drifting in the water. The accused wife-killer was literally sailing off into the sunrise. When word broke that Fletcher had escaped, the Tongan authorities scrambled into action. By 8:30 a.m. that morning, local marine police caught sight of the Sea Oak northwest of Vava'u, motoring away in a bid for the open ocean. A police search and rescue boat gave chase, closing the distance on the fugitive yacht within a couple hours. As the police drew within hailing distance about 16 kilometers offshore, Fletcher suddenly produced a flare gun, normally used by sailors to shoot bright flares into the sky for distress signals. The desperate man turned it on the pursuers as a weapon. He fired several flares directly at the police boat, each one streaking toward them with a trail of smoke. The flares hit the water near the officer's vessel, sputtering and flaming. Dean yelled that he would set the patrol boat on fire if they didn't back off. He also brandished other dangerous gear from his boat's stores, spear guns and knives used for fishing, waving them menacingly at the police. For a tense 5-hour standoff, the authorities tried to reason with him at sea, trailing at a relative distance, but Fletcher was intransigent and clearly willing to harm the officers or himself rather than surrender. Finally, at around 4:30 p.m. that day, the Tongan police boat received orders to call off the pursuit for safety reasons. They had only a small craft and were no match if the yacht's diesel tanks or flare ammunition turned into an inferno. Reluctantly, the officers broke off, and Dean J. Fletcher sailed beyond Tongan waters to freedom. Tonga's police commissioner, Steve Caldwell, admitted defeat and immediately alerted international authorities, neighbouring nations' police, regional maritime networks, and even commercial airlines to be on the lookout for the fugitive yachtsman. The Kingdom of Tonga does not have limitless naval resources. Once Sea Oak got beyond the reach of their one patrol boat and a single search airplane, the slim 54-year-old skipper effectively vanished on the high seas. It was an incredible embarrassment for Tonga. An accused murderer had literally sailed out of their jurisdiction, thumbing his nose at their justice system. As one incredulous observer noted, it was fairly embarrassing to the Tongan police to have a man escape on a sailboat with no wind and probably very little fuel. Indeed, on the morning of his escape, the weather in Vava'u was reported calm. Fletcher's engine was his only propulsion, and if authorities had persisted a bit longer, he might have run out of fuel. Some in the community even questioned whether the police really wanted to catch him at that point. Regardless, Dean was gone, a fugitive at sea. Dean Fletcher's flight across the open ocean was not the stuff of a long pirate odyssey. In fact, his escape path was relatively short, roughly 300 nautical miles north from Tonga, and the saga that ensued on the other side would bring in another player, the United States of America. Fletcher's destination was the territory of American Samoa, the nearest US soil, and a place he perhaps assumed might offer some legal protection given his US citizenship. It's also possible he was simply aiming for the closest large port outside Tonga's reach. Navigationally, it made sense. The capital of American Samoa, Pago Pago, lies on Tutuila Island, about 330 miles from Vava'u. In early October 2016, after several days at sea, the Sea Oak indeed appeared in the calm waters of Pago Pago Harbor, a deep inlet renowned as one of the best natural harbors in the South Pacific. Fletcher's arrival in American Samoa did not go unnoticed. Pago Pago is a tight-knit port, and word of the fugitive's escape had travelled fast on international channels. On October 4, 2016, Dean motored the Sea Oak into port, reportedly in need of refuelling after his hurried voyage. He attempted to pull alongside the main fuel dock, but in an ironic twist of fate, the dock was closed that Tuesday morning because a large tanker ship was in port unloading fuel. Frustrated, Dean departed the harbour, perhaps planning to linger offshore until he could return to fill his tanks. But by that time, the alarm had been raised. An acquaintance of Dean's in Pago Pago recognised Sea Oak and had read press reports about his escape from Tonga. She quickly notified the authorities that the wanted man was in the vicinity. American Samoan law enforcement, together with harbour security, acted swiftly. Before Fletcher could get far back out to sea, local officials intercepted the Sea Oak and ordered him to surrender. Exhausted and with nowhere left to run, Dean Fletcher gave up without further incident. Tongan officials would later reveal there was actually a high-seas standoff just outside Pago Pago, in which a private vessel crew, possibly fellow sailors, convinced Fletcher to let an officer board and detain him. By that day's end, the man who had escaped Tonga was in custody in American Samoa, sitting in a cell in the US territory's seaside courthouse in Fagatogo. For the second time in a week, Dean Fletcher had gone from the helm of his yacht to a jail cell, but now his fate was entwined with the American justice system. Initially, American Samoa charged him with the local offence of unlawful entry, essentially entering the territory without proper immigration clearance. In early hearings at the District Court of American Samoa, Fletcher appeared subdued. Photos from October 4th show him in a t-shirt and shorts, with sunburned skin and a long blondish ponytail, being escorted by an officer after his first court appearance. At one point, upon being led out, the weary fugitive even lay down on a bench and took a nap, hands folded over his chest. He looked exhausted from his ordeals at sea, or perhaps relieved that the immediate chase was over. American Samoa's Attorney General quickly realized this was not a matter the small territory would handle alone. Because American Samoa has no federal court of its own, serious matters involving US treaties and international fugitives are handled by US federal courts, typically in Hawaii. Within a few weeks, agents from the US Marshals Service arrived to take custody of Dean Fletcher. The plan was to send him to Hawaii to face an extradition proceeding, a formal legal process by which Tonga could request the prisoner's return to face trial. Before that extradition process got underway, however, American Samoan authorities explored a simpler solution. In late October 2016, local prosecutors in Pago Pago reached a tentative plea agreement with Fletcher. He would plead guilty to the minor illegal entry charge, which American Samoa would then dismiss, on the condition that he voluntarily return to Tonga to stand trial. This could have bypassed a long extradition fight, essentially a diplomatic handover. In a court hearing on October 28, 2016, a judge was told of this possible deal, but the American Samoan government asked for a short delay to coordinate with Tonga. The judge, Fiti Sunya, granted a 1-week continuance, but sternly reminded everyone that the court's calendar is not at the whim of the Tongan parties. It seems officials wanted ironclad assurances from Tonga about handling Fletcher's case. By early November, those talks gave way to the more formal extradition route. The government of Tonga submitted an official extradition request to the United States on November 7, 2016, invoking a treaty dating back to 1931, when Tonga was under British protection, and updated in 1977. This treaty obligated the US to consider Tonga's request to extradite accused criminals like Fletcher. Fletcher's time in American Samoa was short. On November 30th, 2016, he was handed over to U.S. federal agents, specifically the U.S. Marshals, who promptly flew him 2,600 miles north to Honolulu, Hawaii. American Samoa, having no jurisdiction to try a foreign murder case, had done its part in apprehending him. Now the question was, would the U.S. send him back to Tonga to face trial? When Dean Fletcher arrived in Honolulu in late 2016, he traded the tropical humidity of the South Pacific for the controlled climate of the Honolulu Federal Detention Center. In Hawaii, he was now a federal detainee, awaiting extradition hearings as Tonga pressed its case. The wheels of justice turned deliberately in such matters. Over the next several months, a U.S. magistrate judge reviewed the evidence and the treaty requirements to decide if Fletcher was extraditable. During this time, Fletcher was represented by a federal public defender in the U.S., attorney Melinda Yamaga, since he claimed he could not afford private counsel. The legal issues in extradition cases are usually narrow. The court doesn't determine guilt or innocence, only whether the crime is covered by the treaty and whether the evidence is sufficient to consider handing the person over. In court filings, U.S. prosecutors, on Tonga's behalf, laid out the grim evidence: multiple witnesses of the dinghy assault, forensic reports on Patricia's injuries, and Fletcher's actions after. All of it pointed to a consciousness of guilt. Assistant U.S. Attorney Larry Butrick, arguing for extradition, noted Fletcher had been indicted in Tonga on charges of murder, manslaughter, and causing grievous harm. In January 2017, a federal magistrate held a hearing where Fletcher's defense could raise any objections. Essentially, none of the facts were refuted. Yamaga's focus, tellingly, was not on denying the assault, but on what might await her client in a Tongan prison. On February 7, 2017, U.S. Magistrate Judge Kenneth Mansfield issued his decision. Dean J. Fletcher was extraditable on all counts for which Tonga sought him. This was a major victory for Tonga's pursuit of justice. Judge Mansfield's ruling meant he found probable cause that Fletcher committed the crimes alleged and that they corresponded to offences under the treaty. Normally, that would have set the stage for a prompt transfer of the prisoner to Tongan custody. However, in the U.S. extradition system, even after a judge's approval, the ultimate decision rests with the U.S. Secretary of State. Extradition is both a legal and a diplomatic process. The State Department can refuse to surrender a person on certain grounds, such as humanitarian concerns or foreign policy interests. So although Fletcher remained locked up in Honolulu, he had one hope left: persuading U.S. officials that sending him back to Tonga would violate his rights or U.S. policy. Enter the issues of the death penalty and legal representation. Over the spring and summer of 2017, Fletcher's attorney made an appeal directly to the U.S. State Department, which was then led by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Yamaga argued that if returned to Tonga, her client might face execution by hanging, a punishment that the U.S. generally opposes unless assurances are given. Moreover, she highlighted that Tonga does not provide public defense attorneys to criminal defendants who cannot afford a lawyer. Dean Fletcher, now without assets, his yacht was seized and later mysteriously went missing from American Samoa's port in early 2017, would likely be indigent. In essence, Yamaga contended that Tonga would make him stand trial without any lawyer, in a language he didn't speak, and possibly sentence him to death. The scenario painted was that of a lone foreigner facing the gallows after an unfair trial, something US officials could not stomach. Tongan authorities tried to reassure their American counterparts. Humiliates, Tonga's acting attorney general, communicated with the US that the death penalty was effectively off the table. "We technically have de facto abolition of capital punishment in this country," Kefu explained, noting Tonga had not carried out an execution in over 35 years and had no desire to make Fletcher an exception. In fact, Kefu pointed out that Tonga had seen more gruesome murders than what's alleged against Fletcher in recent decades, and in those cases, the courts only imposed life imprisonment. He called this case a borderline one between murder and manslaughter, implying that even a conviction might result in a life sentence rather than a death sentence. On the issue of legal representation, Keifu candidly acknowledged Tonga's lack of a public defender system. "Providing free legal aid here has always been an issue," he said, citing limited government resources. However, he noted that Fletcher had already managed to hire not one, but 2 lawyers to defend him in Tonga before he escaped, a senior Tongan attorney and another from Auckland, New Zealand. This showed, Keifu argued, that Dean was perfectly able to secure competent counsel for himself in Tonga when needed. The implication was that if returned, Fletcher could re-engage those lawyers or others. Tonga also emphasized that their judicial process is fair and transparent, and as a sovereign nation, they sought only to uphold justice for a violent crime committed on their soil. Despite these assurances, the US State Department remained uneasy. For months, they delayed making a final decision. The extradition treaty technically allowed the US to ask Tonga to guarantee no death penalty in this case, something Tonga would likely have agreed to. But the concern over lack of counsel was harder to resolve. By October 2017, an internal State Department review concluded that these unique factors outweighed the treaty obligations. In a letter dated October 31st, 2017, the State Department informed the Justice Department and the court of its decision. The US would not extradite Dean J. Fletcher to Tonga. Secretary Tillerson exercised his discretion to deny Tonga's request, effectively ending the case in the US courts. On November 1st, 2017, Dean Fletcher was brought back before a federal judge in Honolulu. The judge, having received the State Department's notice, ordered Fletcher's immediate release from the federal detention center. After nearly a year behind bars in Hawaii, the 55-year-old walked out of the courthouse a free man. Outside, he was met by a local news crew. With a mix of defiance and jubilation on his face, Dean told reporters it felt wonderful to be free. He firmly maintained his innocence in Patricia's death. "I didn't kill my wife. That's ridiculous. Unfounded," he declared to Hawaii News Now, dismissing the allegations outright. When asked about the multiple eyewitnesses who saw him beating her, he waved a hand and insisted, "It's all fabricated. Lies. It's all lies." He expressed deep sorrow that Patricia was gone, but said it's a tragic accident and that he had nothing to do with it. In a telling scene captured on camera, Fletcher, wearing a patterned aloha shirt and a baseball cap, raised his palm to block photographers as he hurried down a Honolulu sidewalk, refusing to answer further questions. His attorney, Melinda Yamaga, stood by him and defended the outcome. She argued that no American court would send a citizen to face a possible death penalty without legal representation, especially in a country where he does not speak the language and is certainly not familiar with the criminal justice system. In her view, stopping the extradition was a fair and just outcome. The news of Fletcher's release was met with dismay and anger back in Tonga. The Tongan government, especially Acting AG Aminiasi Keifu, made no secret of their disappointment. They had gone through all the proper channels and proven their case extraditable in court, only to be stymied by what they saw as misplaced concerns. Keifu reiterated that the indictment is still alive in Tonga. The charges against Fletcher remain pending, and the Tongan Supreme Court effectively has a warrant out for his arrest. If Dean Fletcher ever sets foot in a country willing to extradite him under a treaty, Tonga fully intends to restart the process and bring him to trial. "We believe he's committed a crime here in Tonga, and we won't stop until we're able to bring him to justice," Keifu vowed in statements to the press. Nevertheless, he conceded that as long as Fletcher stays within the United States, Tonga has no way to touch him. The tiny Polynesian kingdom does not have the geopolitical leverage to force the issue beyond the avenues it already tried. For Patricia Kearney's family in Canada, the outcome was heartbreaking. They lost a beloved sister and daughter under horrific circumstances thousands of miles from home, and now saw her alleged killer effectively go free. Canadian media later dubbed the case a death in paradise, highlighting the cruel irony of a dream sailing voyage turning deadly. One can only imagine the frustration of Patricia's relatives as they watched an American legal technicality override what they felt was simple justice for Patricia. A Canadian official quietly noted that since the crime and suspect were outside Canadian jurisdiction, There was little Canada could do but trust the Tongan and US process. That trust in their eyes had failed. Many in the sailing community who had been in Neiafu in 2016 remembered Patricia. Some even held a small waterside memorial for her after her death. That her accused murderer would dodge trial disturbed those who believe strongly in maritime camaraderie and accountability. Latitude 38, a sailing magazine that covered the saga, remarked on how astonishing it was to see an international murder case upended by jurisdictional hurdles. Alan Weiner, a Stanford law expert, noted the Fletcher case was highly unusual. The US actually has a working extradition treaty with Tonga, and it's more common to see other countries refuse extradition to the US over death penalty issues, not the reverse. In other words, it's rare for America to effectively harbor an accused murderer from a friendly nation's courts, but that's exactly what happened. Today, Dean J. Fletcher is in his early 60s and, as far as public knowledge goes, a free man living somewhere in the United States. Tonga has since examined reforms to its legal system, including possibly providing public defenders in serious cases, partially in response to the issues highlighted by this case. Yet, even if those changes occur, they cannot retroactively bring Dean back into reach. And so, the final chapter of this saga of the fugitive Yachty feels incomplete. A murder suspect sails off into the sunset, and a small island kingdom is left with empty hands and unanswered cries for justice. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate your support. If you're interested in these types of rarely heard global murder cases, we encourage you to give us a follow or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app, if we may be so bold. It would really help us out a lot. See you next time.